It's not enough to solve a painful problem for customers with an innovative product. That's a great start for a startup company. But the next challenge that we will encounter as a startup entrepreneur is choosing an industry that's favorable for startups. Not all industries or markets or sectors are equally favorable for startups. And in fact, some are much more or less favorable for startups than others. So what are some of the factors that we can look at to determine whether a market is interesting for a startup? The first is this an increasing returns market? Meaning upfront costs are high relative to marginal cost. What does that mean? If a company in this market requires some significant investment upfront, but then is able to scale rapidly without increasing marginal cost, it's good for a startup. If it's not, it's bad for a startup. So a great example, I think we can look at restaurants versus software companies. The initial cost of the restaurant, setting up a restaurant, is relatively low, but the marginal cost of setting up each subsequent restaurant is almost the same as the first restaurant. So as we add more outlets to our restaurant chain, our costs will increase proportionately to the number of outlets that we have. Every time we open a new restaurant, we'll increase our costs proportionately. But software, or let's say mobile app, it's exactly the opposite. When we're developing a mobile app, we may spend a lot of time and money developing that app. But once we complete the app and roll it out, the cost of adding the first user, the 100th user, the 1,000th user, and the millionth user does not scale exponentially. It scales very slowly. So I like to think about it this way. If you look at a company like McDonald's, so although McDonald's is one of the few F&B businesses that has been able to scale successfully globally, there's something like, McDonald's employs something like close to 2 million people, including headquarters and franchises, in order to serve 1 billion hamburgers a year. And if they wanted to serve if they want to add another 1 billion hamburgers, they're probably going to have to add another 1 to 2 million people to do that. Google serves billions of search results every week with 100,000 people or fewer than 100,000 people in the entire company. So this is an example of a market that is more receptive to startups and less receptive to startups. We also look at things like the network externalities, ability to create switching costs, and complementary technologies important to use. Okay, so we want to look for fast-growing segmented markets for our startup. Why? The most important reason is startups are designed to grow fast. They need to grow very quickly over a short period of time. In order for startups to grow fast, this means they're going to need to add customers. There are two sources of customers for a startup. One is customers who are already in the market that the startup enters, but are being served by competitors. The other source of customers is customers who are new to the market. So which source of customers is preferable for a startup company? Is it customers who are already in the market but are currently being served by competitors, or is it customers who are new to the market? It's definitely customers who are new to the market. Why? Let's think about two markets. One market is $1 billion, but growing at 1% a year. If the market is already $1 billion, This means there are companies serving customers in that market. We can imagine a couple of different structures for the competitors in that market. Example, there are 4 big competitors. Each has about 25% of the market. But each of those competitors needs to grow every year. If they only grow at the same rate that the market is growing, they'll only grow 1% a year, which is very low growth. Therefore, they all need to grow by trying to take market share away from the other competitors in the market, and at the same time, they need to defend their market share because the market is very slow growth. So a startup entering this market is going to have very difficult time in growing their customer base because they're going to have to basically fight the incumbents for all the new customers that are entering the market. Plus, they're going to have to try to take customers away from the large competitors who are going to try desperately to hold on to those customers. Or you can imagine another structure. It's a $1 billion market with 1,000 companies with $1 million share each, and all fighting each other for any new customer that comes in, trying to retain share. And again, this will be an extremely difficult market for a startup. But if we have a much smaller market, let's say even $100 million market that is a tenth of the size of the $1 billion market, but that's growing 100% a year. This means there's $100 million of new customers entering the market in the first year, which means that our startup has a much more open playing field in which to acquire new customers. So we always would prefer to enter a relatively smaller but faster growing market. We also need to enter a segmented market because the buzzword for every aspect of your startup strategy, and including market selection, is focus. So we're going to focus on a niche market or a niche in a market, and this means that the market must have segments to provide these niches. We'll talk about this more when we get to marketing strategy, but this strongly suggests that our startup should not be focusing on undifferentiated mass market, and we see very few successful startups in those type of markets. In addition to selecting the right market we need to select the right market at the right time. And this is extremely difficult to do. Now, what is the right time to enter a market? We can try to understand that by looking at this market growth curve. So most markets will develop along an S-curve like the market that like the diagram that we see here. So the market development on an S-curve means that the market will have a relatively long period of slow growth. It'll reach an inflection point. It'll grow rapidly or exponentially after that inflection point, and then growth will level off and market will become somewhat saturated, and then it will be replaced by a new S-curve subsequent. So let's do a quick exercise with this market and try to get our market timing right. So when it's the right time to enter this market, I'll move the laser pointer along the curve, and when we reach the right optimal point to enter the market, you shout out stop. Okay, ready? Oh, what happened? What happened is you missed the optimal point to enter this market. Now, what is the probability that you're going to miss the optimal point to enter this market? The probability that you're going to miss the optimal point to enter any market is 100%. Why is the probability that you're going to miss the optimal point to enter any market 100%? Optimal point means absolutely the perfect point to enter the market. And we can pretty much figure out that the optimal point to enter the market is somewhere along here, just as the market has reached the end of its long, slow growth period and is about to inflect, and we enter just at that point. But optimal means 1 point. How many points are there on this curve? There are infinite number of points and on every curve. So the probability that you'll enter at the optimal point is 1 divided by infinite, which is effectively 0. So you will never enter the market at the optimal point. This sounds maybe depressing, but actually it's very liberating. Why? Because we know the probability of entering the market at the optimal point is 0, so we can forget about that. Now we have a different choice to make, or a different decision is, should we enter too early or too late, meaning before the optimal point or after the optimal point? What is the probability that we'll make that choice successfully, meaning that we'll enter before or after the optimal point? Now it's 50% because there's only 2 outcomes. So we just need to decide about market timing. Do we want to be too early or too late? My view is we want to be too early, because if we enter after the market has reached the inflection point, we will not be the leader in the growth of the market during the first exponential growth phase, which is normally the position that successful startups need to occupy. So but if we enter before the inflection point, at least we have a chance to be the market leader during the exponential growth phase of the market. So I would say we enter too early. Now, then the challenge becomes how early? And this can be very difficult to judge. For example, let's look at a market like virtual reality. I think that this year, by 2019, where we are now, the virtual reality market has already hit an inflection point. That probably it hit an inflection point within the last 2 to 3 years. But when did the virtual reality market begin its growth curve, or when were the first virtual reality products released into the market? I don't know the exact date on that, but I know that I encountered my first virtual reality products back in the mid-1990s. So the mid-1990s was more than 20 years ago, and if you were a virtual reality startup in 1999 or 2005 or 2009, it was very early. So the same thing with desktop video teleconferencing. I encountered my first desktop video teleconferencing product in 1965 in the New York World's Fair, where old Bell telephone had a video phone. And the desktop video teleconferencing market didn't really hit any inflection point until late 1990s, early 2000s. So many companies would have died before they reached inflection point. So the tricky part is we want to enter the market early, but not too early. And this is further complicated by the fact that this curve only becomes visible in retrospect. So we only know when the inflection point was way after it happened, but we're going to need to try to hit before the inflection point.